So today is Saturday, August the 26th, and it's one of the Medway Yacht Club Wayfarer race series. Not quite sure what series it is, but Medway Yacht Club run class racing every Saturday for Dragon, Sonatas and Squib keelboats and Wayfarer dinghies. I think they'd also run a series for handicap dinghies as well, except that there aren't any at Medway Yacht Club at the moment. The juniors do junior things and all the Wayfarer sailors are quite happy in Wayfarers. So as you can see, this is the start sequence, and as you'll also see, it doesn't quite go to plan for us. We have various problems getting the pole clipped on and hooked on and working, but none of it really held us up that much. Today there was a strong outgoing tide and a fresh breeze, so we were going to get blown along whatever. So it wasn't really a panic or a rush, and it turned out quite nicely. The Medway Yacht Club Wayfarer fleet all have boat names and tend to refer to crews by their boat name when they publish their results, so I'll use the boat names while I talk about this race. Ubique, the red boat that you'll see in the distance at some point, made the best of the starts. In the middle of the tide they got the kite up pretty sharpish and just caught the first puff that came along. Slightly nearer the northern shore was Intermezzo, who made a start similar to us, with Muffin just inside them. All the shots you see that are looking outside the boat are taken with a 360 camera, which is on that stick you'll see us waving around at various points during this race, and proved to be frustrating on two counts. One is, trying to handle that big stick in a Wayfarer dinghy while you're sailing isn't actually very easy. We have various problems with it getting stuck, it's never in the right place when you want to get it, when you want to tack it's too long to do anything, and at one point the bag we used to protect the lens got tangled up in the jib sheets, none of which really helped. But what's really frustrating is that this first clip we are using as we go down Heartbreak Reach here, struggling with the spinnakers in the fluky winds, is the only bit where the camera worked. Any of you out there that have got the first Insta360 cameras will know that the silly little LCD screen is just about impossible to see in any sunlight. Consequently, you have to learn a sequence of button pushes just to make it work, because you can't trust what you can see, because you can't see anything. And somehow, after this lot, we pushed a sequence of buttons that switched it into bullet time, which is some funny mode where you're meant to spin the camera around your head. Consequently, the shots it took were useless. So I'm going to make full use of the 360 footage we got here, just to show it off and to break this up. But after this, you'll see us fiddling with this stick a lot of the times, but none of the shots it took ever came out. So I'm afraid you're only going to have the cameras on the front and the back once we get past this first spinnaker leg. So back to the race. Ubique is in the middle, catching the most tide and protecting its wind. We're slightly closer to the north shore because with the southerly element that's in the wind, there's better breeze on this side of the river. Intermezzo is just inside us, with Muffin even further inside. The problem with being inside like that, of course, is that you get the wind shadow of the boats to windward should you want to try and overtake them. But one of the things with Wayfarers is, all things being equal, they're all basically the same speed. So the chances of them getting a puff that no one else got and getting past are slim. But what it does mean is when you get down the end here, where we have the bend and we turn right, you'll be in better wind. Although it's a longer distance to sail, it's always fluky on the corner here of St Mary's Island, and it generally pays to be as far away from it as you can. Obviously there's a limit there because you don't want to sail too much of a distance, but then that's the skill of yacht racing, isn't it? That's why we have that term VMG, which you don't really hear in any other sports. But in sailing, velocity made good, in other words, the time it takes you to get to your next mark, isn't as straightforward as a racing line round a track or any other measure that other sports use. It's always a trade-off for us in the distance you sail against the speed you're sailing at. So when Intermezzo caught a puff and sailed over the top of us, that was obviously frustrating, but I didn't want to get in a trap of us both sailing to windward, trying to protect our air, and sailing right up into the lee of St Mary's Island, where all that dirty wind is coming from. I was happy just to take the pain, let them get over us, but hold my line down here. So that left us in a little group sailing along this shore. Muffin were further inside, with Not Rushing just behind them, We had Little Angel just off our quarter, and I think it was Loose Knots just behind them. But I hope the Medway fleet forgive me for not mentioning everyone, because to be frank, we were a little preoccupied with our own race. So sure enough, as we got to the corner, the wind freshened and got a bit cleaner, but it also went further south and made this spinnaker really tight. One of the perks of being slightly closer to St Mary's Island was although you were in the dirty air, you didn't get the fresh breeze quite as quickly, so your beak held their spinnaker for a little bit longer and then dropped it. Both ourselves and Muffin had to drop it here. We could have battled on with it, but it really wasn't going to pay. The only boat in this lee gaggle that did make it pay was Intermezzo, who hung onto it for a lot longer. Although initially it didn't look like it was hurting them, in the end it didn't pay. As you'll see, they held it as long as they could, hoping the wind would twist round and let them get over the corner at Mears so they don't have to drop it, but ultimately it was just too tight, and when they did drop it, they were out the tide, and the ground they'd made up holding the spinnaker, they lost by not being in the tide with the rest of us. So we've now reached the corner at Mears. Ubeek have held their lead and are looking good. We're second, and I'm not quite sure who was third, but Muffin and Intermezzo must have been pretty close together. Here we turn left to head down river to buoy 26. And in theory this should have been spinnakerable. It's basically the same angle of sail as we had at the start when we went down what we call Heartbreak Reach. But of course, as you've already seen, the wind's gone up a notch, so it's not such an easy call. Ubeek, of course, being the first boat, they're the first people that have to make a decision. And they, not knowing any different, pulled their spinnaker up straight away. We held on for a little bit, A because we were a bit further behind, but B because we thought, let's see how they get on. And it was clear from the off that it wasn't going to be an easy leg. Looking behind, no one else seemed too keen to get their spinnaker up straight away, so we decided to hold on a bit and at least get outside of the moored boats. This would give us more water to play with and more room to bear away should a big puff hit us. This reach was a combination of good fun and very frustrating. Initially the plan was ignore the mark, just sail the boat fast, and then we'll drop the spinnaker and come up to the mark if we have to. But halfway along there was a bit of a lull. I say lull, maybe it wasn't a lull, maybe it just went a bit further west or something, but either way it looked like we could start making 26. And then of course you fixate on perhaps we can do this, and then you're struggling more than you need to struggle and everything gets hard work. Either way, there was an awful lot of flogging mainsail as we were getting pulled along just by the spinnaker because we couldn't handle any more. We'd left the jib right off anyway, and it was all a bit of a battle. Not quite sure who else flew their spinnaker here, but one thing's for sure, even though this was hard work, and even though we had to bear away hard just to drop the spinnaker, by the time we got to 26, we did have a reasonable lead. A little bit of windward heel to help the bear away, and we're on to a run, all the way down to MYA1. Muffin were just a few boat lengths behind us, and they hadn't flown their spinnaker, so it hadn't made much difference, but we were still in front. The hoist was complicated slightly by the dragons, which were on their way back up, and we once again had some problems. But as before, we're now going downwind with the tide in a reasonable breeze, so any problems we had weren't going to slow us up that much. As you can see, the boats behind us were rather hesitant in putting their spinnakers up. Muffin, next round, is really waiting to see what we do. Probably wary of the dragons as well, but clearly not in a rush. I think it's Ubik next after that, and they of course have already had some fun and games with the spinnaker, so they've got good reason to be wary. But once we'd popped out our wine glass, we set off quite happily. We were sailing as deep as we could, probably too deep really, but one thing I've learnt is that angles matter up until the point comes when you're planing. And then once you're planing, none of that really matters so much, you just sail shortest distance. That doesn't apply to all boats of course, and I might be wrong, but in the Wayfarer fleet at least, it stood us in good stead. So this run was pretty undramatic really. It was a good breeze, boat was planing, sun was out, what many people would consider champagne sailing. But it was a dead run, so at some point we were going to have to jibe. And if you've watched us before, you'll know I've said a couple of times that a Wayfarer is a comparatively easy boat to sail. It's comparatively stable and very forgiving, but it does have a lot of sail area. And a jibe on a windy day like this needed to be treated with some respect. As is the way, just as we're getting to the point of a jibe, we get into a puff. Just enough of a puff where you're thinking, I don't really want to jibe in this. But fortunately for us, it just eased off when we got to the point of having to make a decision. So we hastily threw in a jibe, which was nothing to be proud of, but was safe. We then had to mess around a little bit with the spinnaker again to get it all sorted out, but everything turned out okay. Unfortunately, the cameras didn't catch it, but Muffin pretty much jibed when we did. Same puff, same lull, same pressure to make it work, and I'm not quite sure what happened, but one way or the other, the helm fell out the back of the boat, which led to the inevitable capsize. It was a shame, because wide-angled lenses on these cameras don't show you just how close the racing is. We had enough of a lead to know that we were in the lead, but not so much of a lead that we could ignore everyone behind us. So whence Muffin went, first in the line, took a bit of the pressure off. We did have a problem unfortunately, happened a couple of times, that was unique to us. The spinnaker downhaul line would wrap itself around the front camera support. In the tests we'd done, it wouldn't come anywhere near this, but when the wind was strong from behind, and on those occasions when the spinnaker would flog, it would flick the downhaul line well out in front of the boat and wrap it around the camera. The only solution was to send Hannah forward to untangle it, which for a small person with short arms is not an easy task, but she does it well. After this had happened about 3 times, I'd learnt to keep hold of the spinnaker downhaul and just keep a little bit of tension in it to stop it from happening. Although with the main sheet to control and the tiller, and having to jump around the boat to try and keep it flat, that did add something of a complication. So that was MYA1, the furthest mark in this course. From here it was a beat upwind against the tide back up to 26, which you saw us go around earlier, before we bear away again to come back for a second time down to MYA1, and then it was back to 26 and a long beat back to the club. Really, it was a perfect course for this wind direction. A bit of reaching and fetching to get to this point, then a proper windward-leeward leg a couple of times, just like a proper dinghy race. The thing that made it more complicated was the mud. This beat, of course, was against the tide, but on a falling tide, knowing where the water stops and the mud begins is never that straightforward. And in this race, none of our tacks are that brilliant, but certainly those going from port onto starboard were all a bit frantic, because we didn't tack because we wanted to, but we tacked because we'd hit the mud. Second time then at 26, and the wind's calmed down. And I don't think I really noticed on the way up the beat, but it also changed direction. Not a huge amount, maybe 20 degrees at most, but it's enough that I figure we might as well jibe straight away and we'll go all the way down on this jibe. That way, if the wind freshened up again, we're already ready for the next mark, and if it changed back direction and stayed like this, well, we could always jibe again. So here we are, starting the beat for the second time. By now, it's basically slack water, with perhaps the tide coming in, so we decided to tack early and head back out into the river. This, as much as anything, was so we could get some camera footage of the boat sailing past. But a couple of things became apparent quite quickly. One was, they all seemed a bit closer now than they were when we did this last time. And the second one was, once they went round that leeward mark, they stood on and headed back towards the mud, as if the tide was still going out. Now clearly, one of us has got it wrong. But seeing as there's one of us and 10 other boats, odds are it's us that made the mistake. So as we went up the beat, we decided we really should tack across and cover the fleet, but the wind kept giving us a small lift, never really giving us the opportunity to get across. When we did cross and get over there, they definitely closed up. How much of that was us in the tide, how much of that was the bad tack we had to come across on because the wind had never been that kind, and how much of that is because they were just sailing faster than us, we'll never know. But we still had enough of a lead that we didn't have to worry too much, at this stage anyway.
So this is us trying to get to buoy 26 for the last time. It was in that frustrating position with mud all around it where you don't want to bang a corner to get to it because you'll probably overstand. But there's so much mud around you couldn't kind of go as far as you wanted to in the direction you wanted to. So there was a couple of tacks just to enable us to get onto the ley line. So that's just about it. As you've seen, it was just a fetch that turned into a reach and back into a fetch that took us all the way back to the line. We held our lead for the end of what was a good race. We really enjoyed it, even though it was a bit of a handful at times.